Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the place where there is no darkness. For there comes a time when we must bring our own light to this world. And now is that time. I'll begin with a portion of a manuscript entitled The History of Bacon's and Ingram's Rebellion in Virginia in 1675 and 1676 in regards to the siege of the Susquehannock at the Piscataway fort. Quote, "And although it is said that the Indians doth the least mind their bellies, as being content with little, of any people in the world, yet now their bellies began to mind them, and their stomachs too, which began to be more inclinable to peace than war, which was the cause, no more horse flesh being to be had, that they sent out 6 of their chief men to commence a treaty. What the articles were that they brought along with them to treat of I do not know, but certainly they were so unacceptable to the English that they caused the commissioners' brains to be knocked out, for dictating so badly to their tongues, which yet, 'tis possible, expressed more reason than the English had, to prove the lawlessness of this action being diametrical to the law of arms. Now, although it might be said that the Indians went their ways empty-handed, in regard they had left all their plunder and wealth behind them in the fort, yet it cannot be thought that they went away empty-hearted. For though that was pretty well drained from its former courage through those inconveniences that they had been subjected to by the siege, yet in ye room thereof rather than the victuals should lie void, they had stowed up so much malaise, intermixed with the resolution of revenge, for the affront that the English had put upon them in the killing their messengers of peace, that they resolved to commence a most barbarous and most bloody war. End quote. I'll turn now to the beginning, progress, and conclusion of Bacon's rebellion in Virginia in the years 1675 and 1676. The author subscribes only the initials of his name, T.M. Quote, "This about the year 1675 appeared 3 prodigies in that country which, from the attending disasters, were looked upon as ominous presages. The one was a large comet, every evening for a week or more, at southwest, 35 degrees high, streaming like a horse's tail westwards until it reached almost the horizon, and setting toward the northwest. Another was flights of pigeons, in breadth nigh a quarter of the mid-hemisphere, and of their length there was no visible end, whose weight brake down the limbs of large trees whereupon these rested at night, of which the fowlers shot abundance and ate them. This sight put the old planters under the more portentous apprehensions, because like was seen, as they said, in 1640, when the Indians committed the last massacre, but not after until that present year, 1675. The third strange appearance was swarms of flies about an inch long and as big as the top of a man's little finger, rising out of spigot holes in the earth, which would eat the new sprouted leaves from the tops of the trees without other harm, and in a month left us. My dwelling was in Northumberland, the lowest county on the Potomac River, Stafford being the upmost, where, having also a plantation, servants, cattle, etc., my overseer there had agreed with one Robert Hen to come thither and be my herdsman, who then lived 10 miles above it. But on a Sabbath day, morning in the summer anno 1675, people in their way to church saw this hen lying thwart his threshold, and an Indian without the door, both chopped on their heads, arms, and other parts, as if done with Indian hatchets. The Indian was dead, but Hen, when asked who did that, answered, "Dogs, dogs," and soon died. Then a boy came out from under a bed, where he had hid himself, and told them Indians had come at break of day and done those murders. From this Englishman's blood did, by degrees, arise Bacon's rebellion, with the following mischiefs which overspread all Virginia, and twice endangered Maryland, as by the ensuing account is evident. Of this horrid action, Colonel Mason, who commanded the militia regiment of foot, and Captain Brent, the troop of horse of that county, both dwelling 6 or 8 miles downwards, having speedy notice, raised 30 or more men, and pursued those Indians 20 miles up and 4 miles over that river into Maryland, where, landing at dawn of day, they found 2 small paths. Each leader with his party took a separate path, and in less than a furlong each found a cabin, which they silently surrounded. Captain Brent went to the Doge's cabin, as it proved to be, who, speaking the Indian tongue, called to have a machacomicha wiwio, i.e. a council, called presently, such being the usual manner with the Indians. The king came trembling forth, and would have fled, when Captain Brent, catching hold of his twisted lock, which was all the hair he wore, told him he was come for the murderer of Robert Hen. The king pleaded ignorance and slipped loose, whom Brent shot dead with his pistol. The Indians shot 2 or 3 guns out of the cabin. The English shot into it. The Indians thronged out at the door and fled. The English shot as many as they could, so that they killed 10, as Captain Brent told me. and brought away the king's son of about 8 years old, concerning whom is an observable passage at the end of this expedition. The noise of this shooting awakened the Indians in the cabin which Colonel Mason had encompassed, who likewise rushed out and fled, of whom his company, supposing that the noise of the shooting Brent's party to be engaged, shot, as the colonel informed me, 14 before an Indian came, who with both hands shook him friendly by one arm, saying, Susquehannocks, natives, i.e., Susquehannock, friends, and fled, whereupon he ran amongst his men, crying out, For the Lord's sake, shoot no more, these are our friends, the Susquehannocks. This unhappy scene ended. Colonel Mason took the king of the Doge's son home with him, who lay 10 days in bed as one dead, with eyes and mouth shut, no breath discerned, but his body continuing warm. They believed him yet alive. The aforenamed Captain Brent, a Papist, coming thither on a visit, and seeing his little prisoner thus languishing, said, Perhaps he is Pawawag, i.e., bewitched, and that he had heard baptism was an effectual remedy against witchcraft, wherefore advised to baptize him. Colonel Mason answered, No minister could be had in many miles. Brent replied, Your clerk, Mr. Dobson, may do that office, which was done by the Church of England liturgy. Colonel Mason, with Captain Brent, godfather, and Mrs. Mason, godmother, my overseer, Mr. Pimmett, being present, from whom I first heard it, and with all the other persons afterward affirmed to me, the 4 men returned to drinking punch, but Mrs. Mason staying and looking on the child, it opened the eyes and breathed, whereat she ran for a cordial, which he took from a spoon, gaping for more, and so by degrees recovered. Though before his baptism they had often tried the same means, but could not, by no endeavors, wrench open his teeth. This was taken for a convincing proof against infidelity. But to return from this digression, the Susquehannocks were newly driven from their habitations at the head of the Chesapeake Bay by the Seneca Indians down to the head of the Potomac, where they sought protection under the Piscataway Indians, who had a fort near the head of the river and also were our friends. At this unfortunate exploit of Mason and Brent, 1 or 2 being killed in Stafford, boats of war were equipped to prevent excursions over the river, and at the same time murders being likewise committed in Maryland, by whom, not knowing on either side of the river, both countries raised their quotas of 1,000 men, upon whose coming before the fort the Indians sent out 4 of their great men, who asked the reason of that hostile appearance. What they said more or offered I do not remember to have heard, but our 2 commanders caused them to be instantly slain, after which the Indians made an obstinate resistance, shooting many of our men, and making frequent, fierce, and bloody sallies, and when they were called to or offered parley, gave no answer other than, Where are our 4 cockarooses, i.e., great men? At the end of 6 weeks, marched out 75 Indians with their women, children, etc., who, by moonlight, passed our guards, hallooing and firing at them without opposition, leaving 3 or 4 decrepits in the fort. The next morning the English followed, but could not, or for fear of ambushes, would not overtake these desperate fugitives. The number we lost in that siege I did not hear was published. End quote. Turning now to the Susquehannock Fort on Piscataway Creek by Alice L. Ferguson. Printed originally in the Maryland Historical Magazine, Volume 36, March of 1941. Quote, The siege of the Susquehannock Fort on Piscataway Creek in Maryland was of real importance in the early history of the United States. The siege led directly to Bacon's rebellion, which was the first rebellion by the colonists against England and preceded the Revolution by 100 years. It was one of the last chapters in the history of the Susquehannock Indians, and was one of the most elaborate military adventures undertaken by Maryland in the 17th century. It was also of interest on the account of the part played there by Colonel John Washington, the grandfather of George Washington. Professor Wharton Baker of Princeton, in his recent book, Torchbearer of the Revolution, gives the history of the siege, and Dr. Cadzow, in his Safe Harbor Report No. 2, also gives an excellent account of the affair. None of the Indian tribes came as near being legendary heroes as the Susquehannocks. The early discoverers were so impressed with them that their descriptions sound like pages from fairy tales. Captain John Smith described them as a race of giants with voices that sounded as though they came from vaults. While they were not supermen, and the reputed great height is not supported by the evidence, they were a powerful and warlike tribe. After years of fighting, the Iroquois succeeded in conquering them, and in February 1674, a refugee band of Susquehannocks came down into Maryland and camped on Piscataway Creek, near the fort occupied by the Piscataway Indians. The great men went to see the governor and asked that land be set aside for their use, and that they be allowed to settle in Maryland. The Susquehannocks, fighting off the Iroquois on the remote boundaries of Maryland, were one thing, but Susquehannocks, with their reputation of being turbulent, bloody-minded people, living down near the plantations, were something quite different. Maryland had a treaty of peace and friendship with them, and she was afraid to antagonize them, but she was even more afraid to let them stay. Maryland was especially worried lest the Susquehannocks cause trouble with the friendly Piscataways, and it was thought best that the two tribes should be kept as far away as possible. After considerable debate, the Susquehannocks were offered land above the Great Falls on the Potomac. It was quite obvious that they did not want to go so far from the settlements, but they finally agreed. For a year, nothing more was heard from the Susquehannocks. Apparently, the Susquehannocks made no effort to move to the Great Falls, but continued to stay where they were on the Piscataway Creek near Piscataway Fort, and exactly where Maryland did not want them to settle. In July 1675, troubles began. There were murders and robberies in both Virginia and Maryland, which were attributed to the Susquehannocks. In September, the Maryland Council received a letter from Colonel John Washington asking for permission to follow the enemy into Maryland with a force of men and asking cooperation from Maryland. Maryland raised 500 men, including 250 horse, and put them under the command of Thomas Truman. Virginia sent an equal force under the command of Colonel John Washington. But as the operations were to be in Maryland, Major Truman was made the commander-in-chief. The Maryland forces were ordered to proceed to the north side of Piscataway Creek, where Washington is now, and wait there for the Virginians to join them. Truman's orders read that the Susquehannocks, being forthwith forced off from the place they now are, and removed themselves to the place they assured the last assembly they would go and seat themselves. There was no question of annihilating them. Maryland simply wanted them to move. Apparently, the Susquehannocks were not wanted as neighbors even by the Indians themselves. The king of the Mattawamans voluntarily offered all his men to Truman, and the Piscataways, Chapaticos, Pamunkeys, and Nanjamoys also joined the Maryland forces. Truman did not wait for Washington, and on Sunday, September 25th or 26th, he arrived at the Susquehannock fort and asked for a parley. The Susquehannocks were accused of the murders on both sides of the Potomac, but they denied them and accused the Senecas. The next morning, the Virginians arrived, and there was another parley. This time, the Susquehannocks brought with them a silver medal on a black and gold ribbon that a Maryland governor had given them as a pledge of eternal friendship. There is a great deal of conflicting testimony as to what happened. Apparently, Truman ordered the great men of the Susquehannocks bound and murdered, and Washington did nothing to prevent it. The siege of the fort began immediately. The Susquehannocks had only about 100 fighting men, but all accounts agree that they put up a magnificent resistance. The siege lasted for 6 weeks. The colonists lost between 50 and 100 men, and the fort was never taken. During the siege, the Susquehannocks made frequent sallies and captured some of the colonists' horses to replenish their food supply. At the end of the 6 weeks, the Susquehannocks escaped through the colonists' lines with their women and children and crossed into Virginia. They raided the heads, falls of the Rappahannock and York rivers, killing as they went. When they came to the head of the James, they killed Bacon's overseer. This led directly to Bacon's rebellion. Bacon's rebellion was primarily a rebellion against an intolerant and inept royal governor, but it was also a rebellion against the crown, and in 1677 there was a royal commission of investigation. In 1910, Professor Wertenbaker found a map of the Susquehannock fort in the British Public Record Office. This map was probably made for the investigation, and many of the accounts of the siege were written for the same purpose. Among the contemporary accounts is that by Thomas Matthew, who says, quote, "The walls of this fort were high banks of earth, with its flankers having many loopholes, and a ditch round all, and without this a row of tall trees, fastened 3 foot deep in the earth, their bodies from 5 to 8 inches in diameter, wattled 6 inches apart to shoot through, with the tops twisted together, and also artificially wrought, as our men could make no breach to storm it, nor, being lowland, could they undermine it by reason of water, neither had they cannon to batter it, so that 'twas not taken until famine drove the Indians out of it." End quote. Turning now to William and Mary Quarterly Historical Paper, Volume 2, Number 1, originally printed in July 1893. Quote, "June, ye 15th, 1677, recorded. Interrogations by Mr. Daniel Lisson, Mr. John Gerard, and Captain Robert Massey, examiners. Were you present at ye examination of ye 5 Indians and ye Susquehanna fort, all ye time of the examination? To ye first, affirmative. Did you know of any council of war, it was called by ye officers of Virginia and Maryland, wherein it was resolved these Indians should be put to death? To ye second, negative. Did ye hear either Colonel Washington or Major Allerton, or any other officer advise, persuade, or vehemently urge that these said Indians shall be put to death? To ye third, negative. Had not Lieutenant Colonel Washington or Major Allerton ye first treaty with them concerning ye murders and injuries done on Virginia side? And did not Major Truman say he would say nothing to them till they had done? To ye fourth, affirmative. Did Major Truman say, when Lieutenant Colonel Washington and Major Allerton told they had done with them, now I have something to say to them? To ye fifth, affirmative. Did not Major Truman, after some short discourse, cause them to be bound, saying he would send them to Herson's plantation, and show yet some of these Indians were killed at ye front of ye house, to convince them yet it was their Indians had done it, which they had denied? To ye sixth, affirmative. Mr. Stepp, Mannering warrant to Daniel White. By virtue of a warrant by me, received from ye Honorable General Thomas Goodwich, for ye impressing of all ye provisions belonging to ye delinquents, and securing of ye estates of all those yet are fled till further order, from ye right honorable Nathaniel Bacon, general of his Majesty's forces in Virginia. And hearing yet Colonel John Washington's overseers are conveying of corn, meat, and tobacco, and a sloop or sloops over to Maryland, and being myself at this instant going against ye Indians. These are therefore in his Majesty's name to will and require you, Daniel White, upon sight hereof immediately, to go to ye plantation of ye said Washington by ye river side, and cease and impress all ye corn and provision, tobacco, stock, or stocks yet belong to ye said Washington, either one yet plantation, or one ye other plantation called ye Round Hills, and to command ye overseer of both plantations in his Majesty's name not to suffer any corn, cattle, horses, mares, servants, or any other things to be conveyed away by any person or persons till further order from ye general, and to cease yet sloop or sloops yet shall in any wise attempt ye taking provision, conveying of any part or parcels of goods, yet either belong to the said Washington or any other delinquent, yet are fled, fail not hereof, as ye will answer, ye contrary at your utmost pill. Given under my hand this 21st of October, 1676, Stephen Manning. This warrant was recorded June 19th, 1677. End quote. Turning back to the history and present state of Virginia by Robert Beverley. Quote, this addition of mischief to the minds already full of discontent, made by people ready to vent all their resentment against the poor Indians, there was nothing to be got by tobacco, neither could they turn any other manufacture to advantage, so that most of the poorer sort were willing to quit their unprofitable employments and go volunteers against the Indians. At first, they flocked together tumultuously, running in troops from one plantation to another without a head, till at last the seditious humor of Colonel Nathaniel Bacon led him to be of the party. This gentleman had been brought up at one of the Inns of Court in England, and had a moderate fortune. He was young, bold, active, of an inviting aspect, and powerful elocution. In a word, he was every way qualified to head a giddy and unthinking multitude. Before he had been 3 years in the country, he was, for his extraordinary qualifications, made one of the council, and in great honor and esteem among the people. For this reason, he no sooner gave countenance to this riotous mob, but they all presently fixed their eyes upon him for their general, and accordingly made their addresses to him. As soon as he found this, he harangued them publicly. He aggravated the Indian mischiefs, complaining that they were occasioned for want of a due regulation of their trade. He recounted particularly the other grievances and pressures they lay under, and pretended that he had accepted of their command with no other intention, but to do them and the country service, in which he was willing to encounter the greatest difficulties and dangers. He farther assured them he would never lay down his arms till he had revenged their sufferings upon the Indians, and redressed all their other grievances. By these insinuations he wrought his men into so perfect a unanimity that they were one and all at his devotion. He took care to exasperate them to the utmost by representing all their misfortunes. After he had begun to muster them, he dispatched a messenger to the governor, by whom he aggravated the mischiefs done by the Indians, and desired a commission of general to go out against them. This gentleman was in so great esteem at that time with the council that the governor did not think fit to give him a flat refusal, but sent him word he would consult the council and return him a further answer. In the meantime, Bacon was expeditious in his preparations, and having all things in readiness, began his march, depending on the authority the people had given him. He would not lose so much time as to stay for his commission, but dispatched several messengers to the governor to hasten it. On the other hand, the governor, instead of a commission, sent positive orders to him to disperse his men and come down in person to him upon pain of being declared a rebel. This unexpected order was such a great surprise to Bacon, and not a little trouble to his men. However, he was resolved to prosecute his first intentions, depending upon his strength and interest with the people. Nevertheless, he intended to wait upon the governor, but not altogether defenseless. Pursuant to this resolution, he took about 40 of his men down with him in a sloop to Jamestown, where the governor was with his council. Matters did not succeed there to Mr. Bacon's satisfaction, wherefore he expressed himself a little too freely, for which, being suspended from the council, he went away again in a huff with his sloop and followers. The governor filled a longboat with men and pursued the sloop so close that Colonel Bacon removed into his boat to make more haste. But the governor had sent up by land to the ships at Sandy Point, where he was stopped, and sent down again. Upon his return he was kindly received by the governor, who, knowing he had gone a step beyond his instructions in having suspended him, was glad to admit him again of the council, after which he hoped all things might be pacified. Notwithstanding this, Colonel Bacon still insisted upon a commission to be general of the volunteers, and to go out against the Indians, from which the governor endeavored to dissuade him, but to no purpose, because he had some secret project in view. He had the luck to be countenanced in his importunities by the news of a fresh murder and robberies committed by the Indians. However, not being able to accomplish his ends by fair means, he stole privately out of town, and having put himself at the head of 600 volunteers, marched directly to Jamestown, where the assembly was then sitting. He presented himself before the assembly, and drew up his men in a battalion before the house wherein they sat. He urged them to his preparations, and alleged that if the commission had not been delayed so long, the war against the Indians might have been finished. The governor resented this insolent usage worst of all, and now obstinately refused to grant him anything, offering his naked breast against the presented arms of his followers. But the assembly, fearing the fatal consequence of provoking a discontented multitude ready armed, who had the governor, council, and assembly entirely in their power, addressed the governor to grant Bacon his request. They prepared themselves the commission, constituting him general of the forces of Virginia, and brought it to the governor to be signed. With much reluctancy, His Excellency signed it, and thereby put the power of war and peace into Bacon's hands. Upon this he marched away immediately, having gained his end, which was in effect a power to secure a monopoly of the Indian trade to himself and his friends. As soon as General Bacon had marched to such a convenient distance from Jamestown that the assembly thought they might deliberate with safety, the governor, by their advice, issued a proclamation of rebellion against him, commanding his followers to surrender him, and forthwith disperse themselves. Not contented with this, he likewise gave orders at the same time for raising the militia of the country against him. The people being much exasperated, and General Bacon by his address and eloquence having gained an absolute dominion over their hearts, they unanimously resolved that not a hair of his head should fall to the ground, much less that they should surrender him as a rebel. Therefore they kept to their arms, and instead of proceeding against the Indians, they marched back to Jamestown, directing their fury against such of their friends and countrymen as should dare oppose them. The governor, seeing this, fled over the bay to Accomac, whither he hoped the infection of Bacon's conspiracy had not reached. But there, instead of people's receiving him with open arms, in remembrance of the former services he had done them, they began to make terms with him for the redress of their grievances, and for the ease and liberty of trade. Thus, Sir William, who had been almost the idol of the people, was, by reason of the loyal part he acted, abandoned by all, except some few who went over to him from the western shore in sloops and boats, so that it was some time before he could make head against Bacon, but he left him to range through the country at discretion. General Bacon at first held a convention of such of the chief gentlemen of the country as would come to him, especially of those about Middle Plantation, who were near at hand. At this convention they made a declaration to justify his unlawful proceedings, and obliged people to take an oath of obedience to him as their general. Then, by their advice, on pretense of the governor's abdication, he called an assembly, by writs signed by himself and 4 others of the council. The oath was word for word as follows: Whereas the country hath raised an army against our common enemy the Indians, and the same under the command of General Bacon, being upon the point to march forth against the said common enemy, hath been diverted and necessitated to move to the suppressing of forces by evil disposed persons raised against the said General Bacon, purposely to foment and stir up civil war among us, to the ruin of this his Majesty's country. And, whereas it is notoriously manifest that Sir William Berkeley, Knight, Governor of that country, assisted, counselled, and abetted by those evil-disposed persons aforesaid, hath not only commanded, fomented, and stirred up the people to the said civil war, but failing herein, hath withdrawn himself, to the great astonishment of the people, and the unsettlement of the country. And whereas the said army, raised by the country for the causes aforesaid, remain full of dissatisfaction in the middle of the country, expecting attempts from the said governor and the evil counsellors aforesaid, and since no proper means have been found out for the settlement of the distractions and preventing the horrid outrages and murders daily committed in many places of that country by the barbarous enemy, it hath been thought fit by the said general to call unto him all such sober and discreet gentlemen as the present circumstances of the country will admit, to the Middle Plantation, to consult and advise of re-establishing the peace of the country. So we, the said gentlemen, being this 3rd of August, 1676, accordingly met, do advise, resolve, declare, and conclude, and for ourselves do swear in the manner following. First, that we will at all times join with the said General Bacon and his army against the common enemy in all points whatsoever. Secondly, that whereas certain persons have lately contrived and designed the raising forces against the said general and the army under his command, thereby to beget a civil war, we will endeavor the discovery and apprehending of all and every of those evil-disposed persons, and them secure until further order from the general. Thirdly, And whereas it is credibly reported that the governor hath informed the king's majesty that the said general and the people of the country in arms under his command, their aiders and abettors, are rebellious, and removed from their allegiance, and that upon such like information he, the said governor, hath advised and petitioned the king and said forces to reduce them. We do further declare and believe in our consciences that it consists with the welfare of this country and with our allegiance to his most sacred majesty, that we, the inhabitants of Virginia, to the utmost of our power, do oppose and suppress all forces whatsoever of that nature, until such time as the king be fully informed of the state of the case, by such person or persons as shall be sent from the said Nathaniel Bacon, in the behalf of the people, and the determination thereof be remitted hither, and we do swear that we will him, the said general, and the army under his command, aid and assist accordingly. By this time the governor had got together a small party to side with him. These he furnished with sloops, arms, and ammunition, in order to cross the bay and oppose the malcontents. By this means there happened some skirmishes, in which several were killed and others taken prisoner. Thus they were going on by a civil war to destroy one another and lay waste their infant country, when it pleased God, after some months' confusion, to put an end to their misfortune, as well as to Bacon's designs, by his natural death. He died at Dr. Green's in Gloucester County, but where he was buried was never yet discovered, though afterward there was great inquiry made, with design to expose his bones to public infamy. In the meanwhile, those disorders occasioned a general neglect of husbandry and a great destruction of the stocks, so that people had a dreadful prospect of want and famine. But the malcontents being thus disunited by the loss of their general, in whom they all confided, they began to squabble amongst themselves, and every man's business was how to make the best terms he could for himself. Lieutenant General Ingram, whose true name was Johnson, and Major General Walklate surrendered on condition of pardon for themselves and their followers, though they were both forced to submit to an incapacity of bearing office in that country for the future. Peace being thus restored, Sir William Berkeley returned to his former seat of government, and every man to his several habitation. While this intestine war was fomenting there, the agents of the country in England could not succeed in their remonstrance against the propriety grants, though they were told that those grants should be revoked. But the news of their civil war reaching England about the same time, the king would then proceed no further in that matter. So the agents thought it their best way to compound with the proprietors. Accordingly, they agreed with them for £400 a man, which was paid, and so all the clamor against those grants ended. Neither was there any more heard of them there till above a dozen years afterwards. When this storm occasioned by Bacon was blown over, and all things quiet again, Sir William Berkeley called an assembly for settling the affairs of the country, and for making reparation to such as had been oppressed, after which a regiment of soldiers arrived from England, which were sent to suppress the insurrection. But they coming after the business was over, had no occasion to exercise their courage. However, they were kept on foot there about 3 years after, and in the Lord Culpeper's time paid off and disbanded. After the agents had compounded with the proprietors, they obtained a new charter of the king, by which he confirmed to that country their former constitution, with full assurance that they should forever after remain under the protection of his majesty and his successors, and always hold their lands immediately from the crown. The confusion occasioned by the Civil War and the advantage the Indians made of it in butchering the English upon all their frontiers caused such a desolation and put the country so far back that to this day they have seated very little beyond the boundaries that were then inhabited. At that time Jamestown was again burnt down to the ground by Richard Lawrence, one of Bacon's captains, who, when his own men that abhorred such barbarity refused to obey his command, he himself became the executioner and fired the houses with his own hands. This unhappy town did never after arrive at the perfection it then had, and now it is almost deserted by the wild project of Governor Nicholson, who procured that the Assembly and General Court should be removed from thence to Williamsburg, an inland place about 7 miles from it. With the regiment above mentioned arrived commissioners to inquire into the occasion and authors of this rebellion, and Sir William Berkeley came to England, where from the time of his arrival his sickness obliged him to keep his chamber till he died, so that he had no opportunity of kissing the king's hand. But his Majesty declared himself well satisfied with his conduct in Virginia, and was very kind to him during his sickness, often inquiring after his health, and commanding him not to hazard it by too early an endeavor to come to court. Upon Sir William Berkeley's voyage to England, Herbert Jeffreys, Esquire, was appointed governor. He made former articles of peace with the Indians, and held an assembly at Middle Plantation, wherein they settled and allowed a free trade with the Indians, but restrained it to certain marts, to which the Indians should bring their commodities, and this also to be under such certain rules as were by that assembly directed. But this method was not agreeable to the Indians, who had never before been under any regulation. They thought that if all former usages were not restored, the peace was not perfect, and therefore did not much rely upon it, which made those new restrictions useless. End quote. Concluding with a short paragraph from Tales from a Revolution by James D. Rice. Quote, Bacon arrived at Jamestown in the summer of 1674 with 1,800 pounds in his pocket, enough to instantly place him among the colony's planter elite. There he established a contact with 2 older cousins, Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy planter and member of Berkeley's council, and Frances Berkeley, the governor's wife. Bacon made a mixed first impression. The status, wealth, and connections warranted a seat on the council, but the dark, slender Bacon quickly earned a reputation for his ominous, pensive melancholy, and his pestilent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism. He adopted a reserved manner. When he did speak, it was said he revealed a most imperious and dangerous hidden pride of heart, despising the wisest of his neighbors of their ignorance. The young man, it seemed, was very ambitious and arrogant. Perhaps it was for the best, then, that Bacon decided to purchase a plantation on the remote frontier near the falls of the James. Despite having lived and traveled in exceptionally cosmopolitan surroundings, Bacon explained to Governor Berkeley he would be comfortable there. He had, after all, always been delighted in solitude and intriguingly in mystical employments. End quote.